Thank
Great.
you for joining us, Mary Helen. I'm
Thank
so
you for inviting me.
sad that you can't be here in person.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just a very complex situation here in Los Angeles right now.
I
And
totally know and
yeah.
appreciate that. We do have some folks from your area and just holding all of you at heart, really. I'm going to try to actually look at the camera so that I'm looking at you, but
It
welcome.
doesn't,
So
it's fine.
this is
Yeah.
Mary Helen Immordino Yang. She is a partner to come, I hope. I've long been really inspired by your work, and you are by far one of the persons who take the most radical stance to this inner world and trying to kind of create a science of understanding what emotions actually do. And this whole notion that I so often get stuck in with people thinking that rational thought is a thing. And I'm like, yeah, you might want to explore the emotional underpinnings of everything else that's going on in our systems, because otherwise, if we don't get access to that, it'll be very hard for us to create any kinds of changes. So thank you so much for the diligence and the impressive work that you're doing. Thank you for being here today. And I can't wait to meet you in person soon.
Yeah, likewise. And I want to both thank you and the conference organizers and the amazing educators in the room for your work, and also just say that it's no fair, Meta, that you gave such an amazing, such an amazing first talk, because I just had to like add more things into my talk to say yes, and look, look at what the data speak to, what you just heard. So I hope I don't go over, but I will try. That was just absolutely inspiring, and it's been quite a while since I've heard a talk that I was just nodding along with and really enjoying in that way. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. This Here we go. And I'm going to share the sound because I have a short video. Okay. Are you seeing my screen? Yes, I can see that you're seeing my screen. Okay, great. I'm just going to jump right in because it's very fast talk. So I think my talk follows almost uncannily well. Also, I adore Carl Sagan, who I was an undergraduate at Cornell when Carl was there. So that's kind of a blast from the past. Also dates me, but that's fine. I call the talk Transcendence because what we've found, that I think there are many findings and much work that we're doing in the space of educational settings in partnership with young people and their teachers and their families and their communities, that are revealing some of the mechanisms by which these processes happen that you've been hearing about. And so I'm going to focus on one key mechanism, which we're calling transcendent thinking. You can call it something else if you want, I don't care. But the idea is that we're discovering that the power of thinking at a systems level, of thinking beyond the immediate observable here and now, integrating the observable here and now, the factual information, the analyses you can do on the information you directly have, into a broader narrative, a reflective narrative that allows you to transcend situations and specifics, to think about what they together come to mean, what we value in those, how we can imagine them evolving into a future, how they reflect the integration of a historical past, how they come to give rise to the values and beliefs and relational ways of being and knowing together that actually are the stuff of society, of moving forward, of well-being, and what our data show of brain development in our young people. So I'm just going to start with a very quick video from an episode of Nova, which is a scientific TV show here in the United States, where we were featured a couple of years ago. Just because for those of you who work in education, it's hard to imagine sometimes what the experiments that I'm talking about actually look like. So I'm just going to play like 3 minutes where you just see a young person participating in one of our experiments in a kind of simplified, experimental setup, just so that you can get a sense of what we do. Are you hearing okay? Yes, okay.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think. So there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime. They see a lot of dangerous things. They see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Savat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process.
Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Estella. How you doing in there?
Good.
So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
Okay, I'm going to just jump in there and sort of pick up in the interest of time. There's some nice, summaries of the findings, but I'll just dive in. So let's go back for a moment to what Isela said about the way that she felt as she was reflecting on the story that she'd been exposed to. So in these experiments, young people, people across the lifespan. We've done this in China and the US, and we've done it in Switzerland, other places. We've done it longitudinally. So looking at, and those are the data I'm going to talk to you about now, looking at how young people think about their own experience of those stories. So there are 40 stories about all kinds of situations around the world. And we ask kids, how does this person's story make you feel? And then we look at both the brain activity as they are then telling us from the scanner, I'm deeply emotionally engaged and moved and compassionate for this story. I'm deeply engaged with what I'm thinking about here. And we have a sense of what their meaning is because we've just interviewed them about it, and we interview them again when they come out of the scanner. And we're measuring their psychophysiology in their body, we're measuring their brain activity, and we're asking them to tell us the strength of their emotion by pushing buttons in real time. And then we're looking at the pattern of correspondence dynamically within a person, within a child, in this case, a teenager, of embodied and mental and neural activity as those correspond to experience. And looking at the power specifically of what we're calling transcendent thinking in the experience process for literally predicting the future growth of the brain when we bring these young people back in 2 years. So let me be clear that I'm not going to talk to you about comparing Acella's brain to somebody else's brain and saying Acella has this kind of brain. She's, very compassionate or whatever it is, good at thinking about systems level analysis. Instead, what we're saying is all kids in our experiment did at least some of this. There were 65 of them in this longitudinal study. They all did at least some. Some did far more than others. And it was independent of IQ. And independent of their ethnic background, of their socioeconomic background, and of their parents' education level. It's something that the child is coming, the young person is coming to us saying, wait, I want to know more about that. I want to understand what this means. So let's watch Acella show us what that looks like. So she says, this story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor, continue on with her education, but it makes her sad. Knowing her journey would be very difficult. You heard her say that. And it's crazy how it's that powerful. I've colored these different colors because the yellow to me is symbolizing something very direct. She's upset about that girl's situation right now. It makes her sad. Knowing her journey would be difficult, and she wants to be a doctor, and it's going to be hard. But wait a minute. There's something bigger here. There's something powerful here. Now we're seeing Acella move beyond reacting to that girl's situation. And instead, she's signaling to us that she recognizes that there's something at the systems level she could learn from the example of this story. And she goes on to say, and these big long pauses, we've connected those to default mode system activation. For those of you who are neuroscientists, the rest of you don't worry about it. I'll explain in a moment. Right? But it's a deeply reflective. They kind of look away. We've literally shown people, adults too, close their eyes. They look at the ceiling, they cover their face, and they come back with this reflection that having thought about the powerfulness, the implications at a system level of a story, precipitate them like a sort of springboard, reflecting on the substrate of their own self and extending that substrate and honoring the others in the world around them with it, which we might call compassion, expanding your sense of self. It makes me think about my own journey in education, how I want to go to college and hopefully be a scientist someday. And even more, I guess, what really hits me is how not everyone's able to get this chance to go forward with their life and get an education, do what they want to do with their life. What she's basically done is jumped from one girl to me to, wait a minute, there are places in the world where people can't make choices about their life, where they can't get education even when they want to, and it's available. It's not right. She has made a kind of judgment, a moral or ethical stance out of the learning that she did of another person's situation by reflecting in the sense of her own self, in the space of her own self, I should say. I guess when I think more, it makes me feel upset that others live in like certain parts of the world where they don't want people to learn and they're trying to hold them back. But then her story inspires me to work harder so that I could prevent those things from happening. Maybe everyone everywhere should have the chance. All human beings should be able to live free and choose their life future. Imagine what Acella has done here. She's gone from this girl is sad, that makes me sad knowing it's going to be difficult, all the way to all human beings, everyone everywhere. That is the power of what we're calling transcendent thinking. It's systems level thinking. It's ethical, it's deliberative, it's purposeful, it's self-oriented, and it's inspiring. And what we basically find, I only have a moment to talk about this, is that in order to think in these very deep, complex ways, we see activity coordinated across many systems of the brain. This is not something that just happens in your forehead above your eyeballs in the prefrontal cortex, so to speak, right? Or in your amygdala, which is the center of your brain, right? Instead, it's a coordination and network, activity and deactivity in patterns that we've described, and you can read our work if you're interested, between the anterior insula and anterior middle cingulate and brainstem, which are basically like the feeling of your guts. You poke here in a neurosurgery when the person's awake and they puke, basically. This is actual gut somatosensation. This is sitting between your rest of your brain and your spinal cord. These systems of the brainstem we share with alligators. They are essential for consciousness and for survival. You get damage here, you get persistent vegetative state, coma, and even death down here in the medulla. We can't keep you alive without a medulla, right? And anterior middle cingulate is this kind of, kind of arousal, attention, activation of your focus. And then also coordinated with that, these systems that are so-called default mode systems, because they come online, they were named by Marcus Raichle and his colleagues in 2001, they come online when people are resting, when they're not thinking about anything, when they don't have a task to occupy them, where they don't have to watch and respond, but have the space to settle into an inner narrative and build a world that is the world of meaningfulness, that transcends this context and time and self and other, and builds a really what you would call a systems level understanding, what I would call a transcendent understanding. And it's the coordination of these that is actually predicting the growth of young people's brain over time. So this is these two QR codes on the screen are the scientific study at the top, the educator article at the bottom. But basically, the way you can think about these networks, activity and deactivity, and let me be clear, the brain is not tilting back and forth in the head. But what's happening is that certain states of activity are balancing with other states of activity. Certain networks are coming up and going down in a way that is coordinated. So what we see is that what's so-called the executive control network of the brain, the regions that are involved in managing your goal-directed, task-oriented, focused behavior, the ones you need when you're in the middle of a soccer game and you're like, oh, send the ball over here, right? And I'm watching and there's the goal and I'm keeping, right? Which is not the time to kind of sink into this inner state of more reflective, free-form thinking about, the fact that we have green space in our community in which to play soccer and, Title IX sports, right? And the fact that girls can now play, right? And what we know, and many other groups have now shown in the context of mental illness and other things, is that the tipping of these networks, so to speak, the relative activity of one and the other in real time seems to be driven by the state of what we call the salience network, which is really the neural systems I pointed out, the ones that make you puke when you poke there, the ones that go when you see a snake in your path, which are also physiological arousal and managing yourself in real physical space and time, that these systems are kind of doing a calculation of what does this feel like to me? What matters here to me? Is this a situation where I dig in and I focus and I get done? Is this a situation that calls for me to step back and reflect and build this bigger meaning, which of course you cannot do when you're not safe, either physically safe, heaven forbid, or emotionally or socially or culturally safe. If you're watching your back, either figuratively or literally, you are not able to sort of sink into that deeper meaning and kind of close down your outward vigilance in order to build the internal narrative that is the stuff of compassion and systems thinking. And what we find is that as kids do this, they literally predict the future growth of the white matter fiber tracts that are the quote unquote wiring of the brain. So these data are not yet published, but I'll show you the published data in a second. But they just really visually they are the statistical map of every white matter fiber tract in these young people's brains, where the positive change in the density and sort of quality of information transmission in that fiber tract has increased from the first time they came to the lab at age 14, 15, 16, 17, to the next time they came to the lab 2 years later. So we're asking, what predicts this growth in the fiber tracts? Not IQ, not socioeconomic status in our case, not their parents' education levels, but instead the transcendent thinking they do in the interview. The more transcendent thinking, the more that Acela stuff that she pulled up, that blue and green stuff came up as they were reacting, the more growth we could predict in the fiber tracts that go, up to down, back to forth. These are basically all the major fiber tracts of the core of the brain. And this is the scientific study, if you're interested. What we showed is that we can actually predict from the brain growth all the way in a developmental cascade to young adult, what we're calling life satisfaction. So what we did was, for those of you not interested in the statistical model, don't worry, I'll talk you through it. But basically what we have here is that the way adolescents constructed these, what we're calling transcendent construals, thought about the bigger picture, the systems level in the interview, the degree to which they did that, in turn predicted 2 years later the change in the connection, the literal like active connection when they're just resting in the scanner of the default mode, right? The network of the brain that is involved in sort of context independent, broad narrative, autobiographical, time traveling kinds of thinking, systems level thinking, and the network that is on the other side of the teeter totter, which is executive control, dig in, pay attention, watch where you are, ooh, over here, you hit the ball, to me, right? Which you need both, but you need to actively move yourself in accordance with what matters. And what matters is the feeling of your guts and viscera. That's being played out on the feeling of your guts and viscera. That active shifting was predicted by the thinking in the real time. And then over time, it predicted the structural change in the brain at rest, which in turn predicted at age 19 or so, how much kids reported to us when we followed up with them that they had really spent a lot of time and effort thinking about what their purpose is in life, what they care about, what they stand for, who they are as a person, what their identity development or identity achievement is like, as Erickson described it, as compared to saying things like, I don't really know right from wrong. I follow along with what the crowd does. I rarely try things on my own. I just go along with what everybody else is doing, right? Which is not actually healthy for you, and which leads to the kinds of problems that Meta had just outlined in her chart. And then from there, identity development predicted how much young people like themselves at age 21, 22, 23. When you slide a little slider, how much do you like the person whom you've become? Slide the slider back and forth from I really hate myself to I really love myself, right? And who I am now. How much do you feel satisfied with all of the relationships in your life? Here's a whole list of the kinds of people you might have relationships with: your teachers, your partner, your parents, your own child, maybe, your friends, all the way down, your neighbors. How satisfied are you with the quality of those relationships? Those were the things. How much do you feel like your current opportunity in work or school, whatever it is you're doing, is truly an opportunity for you to achieve and you are really doing well at it? Those kinds of outcomes are the ones that we most care about for our young people. And we are predicting them in a developmental cascade from the way young people make meaning transcendently about the world. And what's very interesting to note as educators is you could not skip any step of the chain and get to the end. We can't say by thinking this way, you automatically are going to feel this way when you're a young adult. You have to do the work of actually going out in the world and thinking this way iteratively over time, because it's like the brain's a muscle. You're growing your ability to think in this way as you do it. So what we think is we've uncovered a kind of proclivity or disposition to ask the bigger questions, to think at the systems level. And when a kid shows us that that's what they're inclined to do, when you give them something that's arguably worth thinking about, then we think we send them off into the world and they spend 2 years with that disposition of mind, going around doing this on their own spontaneously. And we think that's what's growing their brain, which in turn is growing them, which is in turn producing the outcomes for them in their life that we most value. So what I just very quickly, and I just added this because I couldn't help it after hearing what Meta said, this is another set of studies that we did looking at the ways that kids have experienced violence, crime, ugly, mean, bad things in their communities, and ask them, what they've seen. And what we basically show is that the more of this they see, the thinner these cortices get. In this case, we're using as our region of interest so-called the anterior cingulate, the center of the brain, which is that pivot. It's part of that pivot. And what matters to me? Well, what matters depends on what kind of world I'm in. If I'm in a dangerous world, I need to be paying attention around me. The more I do that, the thinner that cortex gets over time. It's like it's getting burned out. And we had previously shown that thinness of cortex was actually exactly on top of PTSD meta-analyses for people who have PTSD. It's the same place that they show thinning. And soldiers deployed as ground troops to war in Afghanistan. It's the same place that they show progressive thinning over time. Our young people are showing thinning in this system that is the pivot of their ability to think and move back and forth into transcendent and more action-oriented here and now thinking. But transcendent thinking about the violence they've witnessed was a protective effect. It independently grew the brain or predicted the thickening of those same cortices and in effect undid some of the effect of violence. This is one way in which we've demonstrated the power of a young person's own thinking about the world to teach them how to show up in that space with compassion may actually be protecting them in addition to growing them and their relationships and their sense of self in healthy directions. So just to sum up, in schools, one way to say this is that meaningful learning shifts the educators and the learners mainly away from emotions that are about the outcomes, the results, the test results, what happened, what you're going to do next, what people are going to think, and all this kind of stuff. It's okay to have some of that. But when you are aiming for the emotions to be about the ideas that undergird all of what you're trying, that is a sort of quick and dirty way to think about to what degree are we supporting transcendent thinking and the disposition to think transcendently in the work we're doing. So as educators, you ask yourself, what are the emotions about here? Because whatever you're having emotion about is what you're thinking about, right? And what you're thinking about, you might be able to learn about. Are young people here thinking about what's happening, what's going to go next, what they're going to get on the test, are they going to get into college, what's happening? Because that's what they're learning about. Are they thinking about why balls roll down ramps is actually the same reason why the moon makes the tides? There's this hidden story that is conceptual, that's bigger, that's at the systems level, then that's what they're learning about. Emotions drive the learning. So ask yourself, what are the emotions here about? That's really a paradigm shift. What it means is that, and this is another article we had recently on this, what it really means is that we have to, as educators and as adults, be standing not on the center of the universe, watching the kids go by and predicting their outcomes and then adding on. Like Nana said, you can't just add things to the system. Let's give some growth mindset interventions because Mars is going retrograde, right? Instead, what you need to do is ask yourself, Mars is going backwards. What is the experience for that person as they subjectively perceive it? What is the experience of thinking here for that person? That is the center. That is the sun. And all the other outcomes are reflections that are indirectly giving you information about that. We need to refocus our educational enterprise on the experience of thinking for the adults and the young people in the system. And that is how you can sort of reorient to this systems change from the perspective that we're promoting. And thank you. I can't hear the but I can see the
Thank
clapping,
you.
so
Thank you so much, Mary Helen. And I'm like, okay, great. We now kind of tested out if this would potentially really be as convergent as I had thought it might be. And now I'm just like, please come play and let's make sure that we can really have a lot more kind of co-thinking and reflection on what this can contribute with. Unfortunately, you're not in the space, but the amount of educators from many different places around the world who are entirely dedicated to this kind of learning and growth and development and really are shifting the paradigms in their every moves are right here. So I think that anybody who wants to play with Mary Helen along with me, oh look, raising hands in the room. So that's lovely. We have a couple of minutes now to just hear reflections from people. And it's not so much, of course, if there are questions and all of that, that's great, but it's more like, how is all this resonating with you? We've opened up a conference now. We're aspiring to develop a science of systems change. We've thrown a lot of stuff at you already about what this might look and feel like. What are you sitting with? And just give us a couple of kind of reflections. Yeah? We need a mic so that Mary Helen can hear us as well. Yeah.
Hello, I just want to say thank you for your insights. Something that really resonated with me is that in education, we can't always control the factors and the circumstance that our students are facing or experiencing. But to have the power to provide and cultivate a space that could undo some of the effects on the brain was really powerful to me as an educator, and actually is very inspiring, gives me hope, because the work we do every day in and day out, sometimes you can feel like, am I really hitting the mark? Is this really mattering? But I think that meaningful learning and what we do, especially in my work in partnership with all these lovely people from California and Expanded Learning, I just want to say thank you again for your work. And thank you for your research.
You're so welcome. I'll just say really quickly in response to that too, I did not have time to talk about it, but our newest studies are looking at what this looks like in teachers, both teachers' narratives and teachers' brain activity when they are interacting with their own students, when they're grading them, providing feedback, looking at their work. So I can point you, I will give the organizers of the conference a link to our current studies and the paper that came out that really shows how teachers are talking when we ask them to think about their work, when they are truly demonstrating these things in the classroom. So
thank you. Yeah, others?
Hi, Mary Helen. I've been following your work for a while, and myself as an engineering professor, I've been very fascinated also by the work of Anthony Jack, who is also looking at fMRI patterns and how brain development influences people's choices, behaviors. And one of the things that is a pattern that is very distinct is this thing that you call I think he calls it the task positive network, but
that's the same thing as executive control network in mine.
Right. And that for people who have a lifetime education / practice in objective sciences, that they tend to use that part of the brain, that dehumanizing logics, in situations that would call for the other side of the seesaw.
Yeah,
and so
right.
A question I have for you, or a reflection, is myself as in engineering, and having done this to myself, to my brain, the nerves that fire together, wire together, and sort of creating this highway of objectivity and inhumanity in myself. A question is, what do we stop doing in education that we're doing? Not to add a different way, but what should we stop? For example, you can see that fear narrows the development. Is it possible to stop creating a state of fear throughout the education experience? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The paper that I put the QR code up for last, it's called Weaving a Colorful Cloth. I co-authored it with Naila Nasir, Hiro Yoshikawa, and Pam Cantor, and it was the opening paper for the current year volume of the Review of Research in Education, and we actually look at this. So you might be interested in following up on that paper. But I think the basic idea is the fear about ideas, or is the fear about what's going to happen here and now? When emotions are about ideas, that is inspiring, even if it's negative, right? So you can think, oh my gosh, we have a problem with violence in our community. I need to think about why and how does that happen? Who are the people and how are they thinking about that? So I think the proclivity to leave the space for this broader thinking. So what undermines that kind of broader thinking? over focus on task orientation, here and now productivity. 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, everybody move their pencil on the paper, go, you got 20 seconds to do this, answer the question, right? A little bit of that is fine because in a certain context, it's helping you develop your ability to quickly call up and focus your attention and do tasks. But our education system far overprivileges that side of the seesaw over the reflective, slow-moving side that loses track of time and instead settles into big ideas. So I think we need to stop telling kids all the time that productivity is moving your pencil on the paper. It's actually focusing on attention. It's doing what I tell you in a transactional way and being compliant with the expectations. And it's actually okay, and in fact, really important to find time and spaces for young people to transcend, to ask the big questions, the deeper reasons why, to be curious about the design of the system and why we're doing the things we are. And our system doesn't just not encourage that or not give enough space for it, it actively punishes it by expecting success to look like focused here and now. I give you this, you give me that. And so we need to stop with that. We need much more of a balance between the two. I hope that sort of quickly answers, and I could give a longer answer if you want to follow up later.
All right.
Just very simple things. I'll just say one more thing very quickly before the next speaker. When we discipline kids who misbehaved, right? And we say, look at me and tell me why you did this again. And you got into a fight in lunch again when we decided you weren't going to do that anymore, right? I cannot neurologically look at you and reflect on my experience at that time, right? We need to stop expecting those quick, you must interact with me in a very physically direct way. That is harming to kids. Yeah. So next, I'm sorry.
We have one more question or reflection from the space.
Hi, my name's Lelia. I'm with the youth leadership team for the center. Where I don't know where you live. You live
Los
here.
Angeles.
I'll look at you.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you had mentioned that you had seen that across the board, all of these groups were capable of transcendent thinking. Had you seen any groups that had struggled with it specifically? And for the groups that did struggle with it, what methods have you found to kind of get them to that space? Because with like the youth leadership team and in my experience in my community, we've had a lot of success with having kids name what they don't like or what they see going wrong in their communities. And then when we ask them what we want their ideal to look like, they kind of come up blank. They struggle with it. So.
Yeah, that's right. We're not used to it, because that was one of the questions we used to do that analysis on growing the brain, right? It's like, hey, what are the things you've seen in your community? What do you think could be done about that, right? Well, if you could enact any policy, if you could magically wave a wand and everybody in charge would take your policy, why do you think this happens? Why do you think that guy who mugged the other one, why do you think that happened, right? And the answers kids gave, actually are predictive of their future brain development in relation to the things that they've seen. So we do have work showing, we need far more in this area, but we are partnering, first of all, with progressive educators who really seem to be doing this extremely well, although they don't have the brain data to prove it, so we're doing that. But we do have work showing with an intervention study, a series of intervention studies, that we actually spontaneously increase kids' transcendent thinking by intervention. What was that intervention? It's called Sages and Seekers. This was Rodrigo Riveros' dissertation work in my lab. And what we basically did in partnership with the Sages and Seekers organization was to invite teenagers and elderly people from the same communities to participate together in an 8-week storytelling program, right? It was not a mentoring program. It was a program in which young people and their elders came together. They got to know each other in these funny, sort of ways in which they told funny stories about themselves. And then they settled and they chose a partner to become friends with. And they spent 8 weeks sharing their own stories and learning to help the other person tell their story. So the elderly people were constructing sort of generative stories of the meaning of their life and what they have accomplished and what they're giving back and leaving with the world, which we know is predictive of all kinds of health and well-being in elderly people. And the young people were inventing the stories of who they wanted to be. And the two were working together. And we had the kids give, just do standard questionnaires of purpose and wisdom and things like that at the beginning and the end. And what we found is that, yes, they increase, but they increase in a way that's mediated by video diaries at the end of every session. Kids just told us, what are you thinking about today? What do you want us to know? What happened today? What are you left with? How are you feeling at the end of today's session? And they left us a little voice video on their phone. And what we found is that transcribing and encoding those, transcendent thinking systematically increased across the intervention in these very interesting ways, which we describe in the paper. And then the increase in transcendent thinking mediated the effect on purpose. So in other words, the transcendent thinking started to happen as kids felt safe in a close relationship to reflect on the bigger shared qualities they had with their senior. And then as that started to happen and they started to feel gratitude for that senior and wrote a tribute to them and all these kinds of things and thought about who they wanted to be, they naturally started to develop these proclivities, and that mediated the increases in the psychological variables like purpose. So we know, at least in that case, we're able to increase it by actually sitting with kids and building them a safe, supportive relationship in which they can start to explore these ideas.
Mary Helen, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
For
it's quite an honor.
sharing your reflections.
I appreciate it.
I'm thinking that this probably won't be the last time we get to check in. And I know we're working on setting up a call, but one thing that kind of just came to mind right now, we have in our we have a global community of people, really working with compassionate systems change in many different areas around the world, primarily focused in education. And we sometimes do what we call deep dives, which are basically like 3-hour Zoom sessions. And perhaps we could invite you to come and do a deep dive with us, because it sounds as if there might be more questions in the space, and that people would really like the opportunity to also reflect together with you, so that all of the many reflective practices that is integral to our work can be modeled, so that we too may actually share some of these experiences and then begin to reflect on, okay, so how can we create these fields for our kids to grow up in as well? So that at least would be a kind of an inspiration for me, and I'm sure for many others in here. So with that, this is, I think, the time for I've somehow managed to lose my agenda already. We will come back at 11. So we now have a 23-minute break. And Mary Helen, thank you, and to be continued.